Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the world distribution of income, and that back in the 1970s, the world distribution of income looked something close to a bimodal. This is weighted by population, of course. So there was a lot of poor people in the world, but also there was the rich people in the OECD in the 1970s. But as time went by, the 90s, the 2000s, now the world distribution of income looks something more like a single model world instead of a bimodal world, and there's a lot of people concentrated in the middle. Meaning we came from a world in which there was a really high polarization between low-income and high-income countries, and over time this seems to have been converted to something more, less extreme. And as a consequence, the amount of poverty rates in the world seem to have declined dramatically. Back in the 1970s, there were the whole chunk of people that were poor as a proportion of the whole world's population was extremely high. Was all this big chunk because there were a lot of poor countries with people below the poverty line, which is usually taking the $1 a day, which is kind of random, but that's there were a lot of people in the world below the poverty line. But nowadays, as some of those countries have moved to higher incomes, there's less and less people living below this poverty line. So the poverty rates of the world have declined dramatically. And also, as we have mentioned before, we passed from this bimodal world to have a single modal world. So the inequality, the global inequality, has declined. One big reason why is that since the 1970s until nowadays, it turns out that if we weight countries by their population, we have cross-country convergence in economic growth. So on average, poor countries, when weighted by population, have been growing more than rich countries, and that leads to see something like this. So at the beginning, China and India and other Asian countries were right below here, but over time they've been converging up towards the middle because they've been growing a lot. And the US and other countries have been kind of staying there, or even regressing, as like the recent financial crisis and stuff. So the whole world has been converging towards the middle. But take care, everybody is growing. So basically, this distribution is moving to the right. Everybody's becoming richer. So what we do to estimate this world distribution of income is to take the average to be for each country to be the GDP per capita that they have, and then we estimate this variance using OLS by running OLS on survey data, and that way we can get a pretty good idea of what not only the world distribution of income is, but also what is the distribution of income for each country in the world, and see how these evolved over time. So, as we mentioned before, in the 1970s, the world was fairly bimodal, and that over time has been converting to a modal world. And the reason for this, big reason, was that countries like China or India were below the poverty line back in the 1970s. They were living under the $1 a day threshold, and they have huge populations, so they were accounting for this big chunk here. But then, as time went by, China and India developed. They became emerging countries, and their population was basically richer. The income per capita in these countries rose dramatically, and they have barely any people below the poverty line nowadays. In contrast, other countries such as Nigeria or the rest of Africa that have big chunk of people below the poverty line back in the 1970s still remain with high rates of population below the poverty line nowadays. So they haven't experienced this big shift of people where everybody became richer that people in China and in India experience. So this Chinese people becoming richer in terms of income per capita has definitely been one of the main causes of this shift from a bimodal world to a this was China back in the 1970s, and this is China today. So there's a lot of people, but also people are richer. So this is like kind of like the cause, one of the main causes of the shift towards a single modal world nowadays. But this also means that the amount of poverty, the poverty rates in the world have declined also dramatically. Back in the 1970s, 30% of the population was below the poverty line, below the $1 a day threshold. But nowadays, only 10% of the population lives below the poverty line. So kind of like the distribution of the world income has shifted to the right, leaving us with a less proportion of poor people in the world, and everybody has become richer. And then this poverty rate reduction has mostly be due to the post 1995 period, because the 80s were not really a great period for developing countries. Poverty rates were going up, the growth rates of income were going down. Some countries in Africa had negative growth and GDP went down. But then after 1995, poverty rates have been dropping consistently and dramatically, and income, GDP in Africa, and also, as you can see, in East Asia has been rising, leading to reductions in poverty rates. So we see this massive reduction of poverty led by increases in income in the developing world, and this is basically one of the causes of the shift from a bimodal world with a lot of people below the poverty line to a something more in the middle. But this also means that there's been a reduction in the world income inequality. So this might sound striking. We know that Piketty and others account for increases in inequality. But this is we have to take care of this, because this is within income inequality. So income inequality in the U.S. and in France and in Europe and other countries has been increasing over time. That is true, but it's also true that cross-country inequality, what we saw in that distribution of income being shrinked, has been declining dramatically, and this has overpowered the amount of increases in inequality that we saw within the U.S., within France, and so on. So overall, global inequality since the 1970s has been declining dramatically because of this overpowering effect of reduction in cross-country inequality. And the reason why is what we said before. Basically, poor countries are catching up. They're when weighted with population, Asia and Africa and this developing world has been growing way faster than countries in the OECD, which especially have been hit by the last years of financial crisis. Most of them, China and countries in Africa like Angola had the highest growth rates of economics of income in the last decades. And that led to this convergence in means that ultimately led to the catching up of poor countries that we see in this world distribution of income. So basically, the world is becoming more equal, more tending towards this mean, instead of being the bimodal world that we saw in the 1970s. And it's not only China; it's also other poor countries that are growing really fast, and that is leading to this change in the shape in the world distribution of income, lowering poverty rates from 30% to 10%, and also lowering global income inequality.